Hi, Alex.
Hello, Karen.
I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, I am too.
I have some questions about entropy.
Mm. Oh boy.
And as I recall, we had also said the next time we were going to discuss the arrow of time. So I've tried to understand that a little bit better. And then I also want to discuss this lecture by Dr. Eric McCloskey on the Earth as a giant battery. I thought maybe with your background in geology, you might have some insight into that.
Well, sure. Yeah,
Okay.
I did watch that video. I thought it was really full of information.
Yeah. So let me ask my questions about entropy first,
Right.
so that I can clear some of those things up. It'll help me, I think, a little bit better when I'm discussing McCloskey's lecture.
Mm-hmm.
So you remember last time we were talking about how when there's a ball balanced at the top of a hill,
Mm-hmm.
and if it's a perfect balance, so it's not going anywhere, that's a point of maximum potential energy. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah, that makes
And
sense to me.
so then is that a point of low entropy or high entropy?
Yeah. Uh, we're used to thinking about it. I'm used to thinking about entropy in terms of the exchange of energy,
Right.
and so the classic example is you have a warm body next to a cold body, and the heat will transfer from the warm to the cool, so
Mm-hmm.
that there's a balance. And um, so that's
So
essentially.
maybe there's potential entropy in the. So the reason I got thinking about that is that in the so then when you think about the ball rolling downhill,
Hmm.
then what's happening? Is that an energy exchange?
Yeah. Yeah, yes, it's an energy exchange. But it seems like, and I've looked at this since we talked last too, and just trying to understand what is the misunderstanding and what is the confusion over entropy, because it seems like there's, even amongst you know trained scientists that deal with entropy, or professors that talk about and teach entropy in their classes, um, from what I could gather, there's a misunderstanding or different ways of looking at it that can be confusing. And I guess what I landed on is that entropy is really just an observation of nature that says that energy wants to um, move towards a vacuum, essentially, whether that's information, or whether that's um, potential energy of due to gravity, the force of gravity, whether that's a difference in potential along a copper wire, and the electrons are wanting to move, or anytime there's motion, it implies an opposite. There's opposites at play, and the tendency is in nature is for things to want to move into balance. And so that tendency is called entropy.
So when it's moving towards balance, then that's increasing in entropy.
Well, not exactly. It's because it's when things are in balance, there is no entropy.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
yeah, so it would be moving towards less entropy, I guess. But entropy is just that tendency of things to want to move from. Um,
Well, then it seems like it would be a tendency of things to move from balance, because
yeah.
if balance is low entropy and the universe is always increasing in entropy, then we're as a universe, we are moving out of balance. So maybe
Hmm.
balance isn't a good metric by which to look at it.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah.
There's a local system, and then which is like, you call that a closed system, and it doesn't take into account anything outside of that system. That's another source of confusion, I think.
Right.
So that you
Like our
can,
solar system is an open system because we are just one of many solar systems, and we also have the sun within our solar system that's a source of energy.
right?
So we're not a closed system here. But then I guess there would be some debate as to whether or not the universe is a closed system.
Exactly. So that's like, that would be the where you start to get into the different theories of physics, as far as the many worlds theory,
Mhm.
what creation, um, Big Bang, and how do you deal with that concept of, who created God? Essentially, would be the um, the things that we're just not capable of understanding.
Uh-huh. So, so Dr. Eric McCloskey, in his discussion about the origins of life, he starts out by talking about the Earth as this kind of gigantic battery. That there's iron at the surface of the Earth, and that iron is continually being reabsorbed down into the center of the Earth, sort of recycled in the core, and then thrust back up to the outer edges of the Earth, through rifts underneath the ocean or through rifts at the surface of the Earth. Earthquakes and instabilities and things like that are always bringing this iron back up to the top. So this is sort of a fundamental requirement for life on Earth, that all had to be there before life on Earth could develop. I had never heard that story before. Had you?
No, I had not. No.
So this is a fairly new finding in geology then, or?
Well, I think his research is, I don't know that to say that it's singular or not, but it's certainly not the mainstream.
Okay.
Um,
Because this whole idea that there are these passageways that iron makes its way back down into the center of the Earth, I just thought that was really
oh yeah.
weird. But he's apparently a very well respected authority, and he's not on the fringe. So
No, I guess I mean to say that the cycling of material, iron, from the surface down to down below, and then bringing it back up, that is well established.
oh, I see.
But
It's interpretation.
the link, right? The link to the link that he's making to, that there is essentially a continuity between inorganic life or inorganic material and organic life.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the part that is unique.
Okay, and so that information came about from something called the Alvin expedition, when they went to these areas where the rifts are underneath the ocean, and they looked at the venting to see what was being produced, what kind of life was being produced down there by the venting of this oxidation coming back up through the iron and the warm temperatures of the water and so forth. And they found all of these organisms, some of them, I guess, organic, and some inorganic, and some somewhere in between.
Right.
But so he made this comment, and here's the quote: "Some of the rules of life are written into chemistry and the interplanetary flows before there is ever material for evolution to act on." So that's why I sort of boiled down his whole talk into this idea that the Earth breathing in this way of the oxygen, the oxygen in the iron at the surface of the Earth being brought back down into the center, kind of recycled and then pushed back out again, and that this continually goes on, and this is what makes makes Earth capable of producing life, which is why he thought maybe that makes Earth somewhat singular in the universe as being capable of supporting life. He said that he was reconceptualizing life through ecosystems and universal metabolism. And he looked at ecosystems as being more fundamental than organisms. So that totally makes sense. I mean, that just seems like practical common sense to me, that if there's no ecosystem in place, even if a life could develop through evolution, there has to be an ecosystem in place for that life to thrive. I mean, you can't just put a new organism out on a rock and expect anything to happen. There has to be something there, some life that supports. So that makes sense to me. And then he went on to say that he asked the question about any organisms, where does it get its energy? And he divided them into two categories, reductionist and oxidative. And he said on the reductionist side, there are organisms that give electrons, like hydrogen does. And on the oxidative side, there's organisms that take electrons, like oxygen does. Mm-hmm. So all the green life, plants and animals that thrive on plants and so forth, are oxidative, so taking electrons. And so it occurred to me that that's once again taking all the complexity of life and breaking it down into a binary system. It seems like everywhere we go, we run into this binary system.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about his ideas there?
I think the most interesting thing that he said was that he made this analogy between a surfer on a wave. Mm-hmm. He said that from what he's observing about the earth and how it supports life, it's almost as if the wave created the surfer, or the wave generated the surfer, as opposed to the surfer thinking that the surfer was taking advantage of, or having a hard time finding the right words, but
responsible for
the wave, or somehow separate from the wave, I guess would be more accurate. And even though we're, as he said, at this maybe an infancy of understanding of this way of looking at things, my intuition is that he's right. That, and the more that we hear about mathematicians, biologists, and geneticists talking about the impossibility of complex life forms arising from simple forms of single cellular life, the astronomical possibilities that, how these proteins and that are involved in the mechanics, the workings of our cells, and how they differentiate according to the genetic code and create complexity, for those things to fold together the exact way that they do to create the life forms that they do, for that just to happen by chance over time, it's just actually not possible. And there's so many scientists coming forward now, sort of against the winds of Darwinism, to state scientific fact, along those lines.
Right, and I've been hearing a lot recently about the whole protein folding problem, that it's not only that the number of proteins that have to be linked in the proper order to create, I mean, the number of amino acids that have to be linked in the proper order to produce a protein, but the protein has to be folded in exactly the right way. And not only that, but now they've discovered that the folded proteins degenerate rapidly if they're not in a correct environment and not being utilized immediately. So even if you did have the 1 out of 10 to the 70th something probability of having a single protein develop in that way and fold properly, it would degenerate before another protein could come along. And yet even the smallest organisms have something like 20, at minimum of 20 proteins, each of them unique in the way that they're folded and in the job that they have to do. But then when you listen to this guy, he's going back one step further than that, saying that the chemical substrate has to be in place before any of these other things can happen. And that chemical substrate is based on rules of life that are written into the chemistry.
Yes.
So, and I've had thought about that a lot. When you look back at the table of elements, it's so beautifully structured. How could that be an accident? And I never hear anybody talk about that. They just sort of take it for granted. Here's this beautiful table of elements. Of course, I mean, it's beautiful because somebody took the time to lay it out and show it to us.
Yeah, Mendeleev, or that was his name.
You couldn't lay it out and show it to us unless the structure was there to start with, right?
Yeah, that's right. There's a distinct number of elements. This is something I learned recently that I didn't know, was that I remember being in school and learning it wrong, that there was still elements out there. There were still elements that haven't been discovered, that, there were holes in the periodic table. Well, that was true, but only like maybe up until 1920 or something like that, where someone found the last missing periodic or table element in the periodic table. And so they're all there, and that's all the elements there are all the elements that can ever be there, that can possibly ever exist in the universe.
Oh, you mean not even just on Earth?
Right.
Well, because you watch all these science fiction movies and stuff, and they're always showing some element that doesn't exist on Earth, that exists there, that has properties that we don't have, and anti-gravitonium or something.
Yeah. Well, they find an alien spacecraft crashed or something, and they say, this element doesn't exist.
So how can it be elements? How can it be that everything? How can they know?
How can you know 2 + 2 is 4? I guess would be the same question. It's like, because it's mathematical, physical possibilities.
I see.
I mean, I guess to the extent that we put our trust in science and scientists that have done this work and have proved these things, I mean, at some point we have to, if we want to talk about those types of things, we have to put a certain amount of trust in that people know what they're talking about, and which is harder and harder to do all the time. But I guess all I can say is, that's what they say.
Well, so when McCloskey is talking about this cycle of metabolism, he shows that the most fundamental cycle of metabolism comes down to these 11 citric acid combinations or something like that. But then he goes on to kind of analyze the way that it works, and it's sort of a descending order where the metabolism, the history of metabolism is always kind of moving down a hill. So he was saying basically it's an inevitability that life would develop, given this cycle of metabolism out of these inorganic materials that are metabolizing in a certain way, and then that it's inevitable that that life would come out of that. it was very complicated, so I didn't write
Yeah.
down all the stuff. But the idea is he's got this downhill thing, which is why I was asking you about the ball rolling downhill with entropy, because we had agreed to talk about the arrow of time today. And the arrow of time, one of the things that that I was looking at with the arrow of time is this idea that, well, there's two ideas. I have to go back a little bit, but I'm going to connect it up with that thing coming down the hill.
Okay.
One idea is that so time is symmetrical as regards particles at the quantum level, because the laws that govern the particle moving one direction are the same laws that govern it moving in the reverse direction. So in that, they say that time is symmetrical, so that theoretically things should be able to go backwards in time if all that we were looking at is at the quantum particle level. But when you take into account entropy, then you have to think about time as only moving forward, because entropy always increases. So entropy is asymmetric. And so I found this on Wikipedia. If we follow the arrow of time, we find more and more of the random element in the state of the world.
Mhm.
Then the arrow is pointing towards the future. If the random element decreases, then the arrow is pointing towards the past. That is the only distinction known to physicists, and that the only distinction known to physicists is that the randomness increases towards the future, the randomness decreases towards the past. So this follows at once if our fundamental contention is admitted that the introduction of randomness is the only thing which cannot be undone. So I thought that was an interesting concept, that introducing randomness is the only thing which cannot be undone. Now, I'm not sure exactly how far they go with that when they say it cannot be undone. Certainly,
Yeah.
It can be undone if there is an introduction of outside energy input. I mean, if I produce a lot of randomness on my canvas, I should theoretically be able to go in and unproduce the randomness by bringing some order to it. But if the randomness has been produced and then there's no outside energy input, then of course it can't be undone.
Yeah.
And maybe they're saying that because when the physical laws are operating for a certain level of organization, let's say a crystal is forming. So the physical laws are operating in the formation of that crystal. But then if I throw a nacre in the oyster, so to speak, if I throw a particle of sand in there, or introduce some element of randomness, then that crystal is not going to catalyze the way that it had started out to do. So I've introduced a randomness that now cannot be undone. It can't go back to its other organizing principle because it can't deal with that piece of randomness. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it would have to work around to that.
Yes.
And it would be perhaps influenced by the randomness, but the overall propensity of the system to tend towards random distribution, I guess, would be the same.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's still like a confusion of terms, I think.
Okay.
Involved.
Confusion of terms in terms of time or in terms of the meaning of random?
Well, so in terms of time,
Okay.
from what I've understood by listening to physicists talk about this,
Mm-hmm.
this is not my field.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not that it isn't possible for the arrow of time to reverse. It's just that it's extremely unlikely for it to happen. So all those things are,
We get into the probability issue.
yeah,
Okay.
probability and the tendency. Again, so like if you look at entropy as a law,
Mm-hmm.
I think that is a mistaken way to look at it. Just like if we look at the laws of electrical magnetism, we call them laws, and that makes us think, well, that's the way they are.
Mm-hmm.
But really, that's the way they tend to be 99.999% of the time.
Uh-huh.
But it's not against the law. So that's when you start talking about at the quantum level, when you're not held captive to the tendency of things anymore, because you're in the realm of pure probability, outside of the realm of, say, gravity and electromagnetism and the things that, the physical laws of nature that we observe with our eyes. At some level, at some point underneath all that, there's a quantum level that is where time doesn't really go in one direction. It just, when it manifests, because it's potential, because it has the potential still, it's in that realm of potential of probability. It's not in the realm of manifestation yet. And so but as soon as we observe it, or is something that we can observe, it comes into the realm of manifestation, and then it abides by these laws that we call laws. But they're really strong tendencies that we observe, and then so we call hey, that's the way it is all the time, let's call it a law.
That
But it
really
doesn't have to be.
Understand quantum physics at a much clearer level, understanding where quantum physics kind of comes in the hierarchy of probabilities, I guess. So I saw one video where it was talking about this whole issue of entropy and probabilities, and it showed, let's say you take a whole bunch of little random balls and toss them out on a big square, and you're going to get just a random distribution, 95% of the time or whatever. And once in a while, it is theoretically possible that those balls could arrange themselves in a series of letters on that stage that would be actually organized into something readable. That's theoretically possible.
Yeah.
It's theoretically possible that all the balls could end up over on one side of the cage and no balls on the other side of the cage.
Yes.
But the probability is so small.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what it's talking about, is that very small probability is why they say that we're always moving towards increasing entropy, because the probabilities are too small for it to be decreasing. Right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So the next thing he says about the arrow of time is that it's so the arrow of time is one way, or asymmetry of time. So there's a thermodynamic arrow of time provided by the second law. There we go, the law thing of thermodynamics, which says that in an isolated system, entropy tends to increase with time. So this asymmetry can be used empirically to distinguish between the future and the past. So measuring entropy does not accurately measure time. Also, in an open system, entropy can decrease with time. So in a closed system, entropy always increases with time. But in an open system, it is possible for entropy to decrease with time, because in an open system, there's an outside input of energy, which would increase the probabilities. Okay, so I thought that was really interesting when I put that together with, you and I had some email conversations, and you laid out 3 possible ways of looking at time, which really helped me a lot. You said the first is material sense of time, understood in terms of, like mechanical laws like causation and decay and entropy. A second would be the experiential sense of time, like we have a sense of time speeding up or slowing down or standing still. Like even if we're riding in a train and the landscape is speeding by, okay? So we have all these perceptions of time. And then we have a third aspect, which is at the quantum scale and is speculative because it gets into pure theory. But I wanted to go back and look at that first way of looking at time, which is strictly material and understood in terms of causation, decay, and entropy. Because I heard one guy say that the speed of light isn't actually the speed of light. That when they discovered the speed of light, when Einstein came up with the speed of light, what he actually found, they think now, was the speed of causality, not the speed of light.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, had you ever heard that before?
No, I haven't.
And near as I could understand what he was saying, I think what he means by causality is cause and effect. One thing affects something else.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say at the quantum level, you have entangled particles. Once particles become entangled, no matter how far apart they get, what happens to one particle happens to the other particle.
Mm-hmm.
But as near as I understand, well, so maybe this doesn't work at the quantum level because what happens to one particle happens to the other particle at the same instant. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Not at the speed of light, but at the same instant.
Yes, that's my understanding. Independently of the speed of light.
Okay, so at the quantum
Instant.
level, the speed of light doesn't calculate at all. So it would only be at the material level where the cause of one thing would have an effect on another thing. That cannot be any faster than the speed of light. That causality. So if now I'm really going into theoretical stuff here, but you know how they say if a butterfly flaps in a forest in Brazil, it can cause a tsunami in Japan or whatever.
Yeah.
Right?
That's initial conditions, dependency on initial conditions.
So no matter what the initial conditions are on our planet, or if some asteroid is going through space and it gets close to it taps something that moves off somewhere else, and whatever one thing is causing another thing to do, that causality cannot happen any faster than 300,000 kilometers per second.
Yeah, we can't perceive it happening any faster than that anyway.
So you think maybe it just comes down to perception?
Well, I mean, I don't have a well-formed theory about it or anything, but it seems like from what you're saying that there's a distinction between this instantaneous nature of that we see evidence of an entanglement, mm-hmm. that implies something outside of time. Instant means without time, no time at all. And then there's this thing that the speed of light and relativity where time comes in and appears to be an arrow and moving in a direction, and one thing is that can be messed with to a certain degree, depending on how fast you're traveling relative to something else, according to the theory of relativity. Mm-hmm. But at there's some limit to that where those things are limited within the confines of the speed of light. And the confines of the speed of light is the confines of our perception of reality. we can't perceive beyond that, but the closest that we've been able to get in terms of science, which is maybe one of the greatest mysteries of science, is this question of entanglement. What the heck is that? Yeah.
Yeah.
What is going on there? And
Yeah. Well, so, but if we just think about times in terms of perception of time,
yeah.
So I don't know if you got a chance to see the discussion that I had with Michael about data compression.
I did the first half of the video, and then I had to go do something else, and I haven't got back to it, but I'd like to watch the rest. It was really interesting.
So one of the things we were talking about was how, and this is one of Michael's ideas, that story and narrative are actually sort of a means of data compression. And I had never really thought about data compression in that sense before. But
yeah, that was really
we can communicate a story to someone else. Well, I guess there's a lot of aspects to this.
Mm-hmm.
The entertainment industry has certain stories that they recycle over and over and over again. So they're very familiar to us. And one of the famous ones is Boy Meets Girl.
Sure.
But the minute you say boy meets girl, what you're really saying is boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, girl either says yes or no, and eventually girl falls in love with boy, and then eventually they live happily ever after. So boy meets girl is, in one sense, a data compression for that larger story, which we can say in a minute. But it's also a data compression for a much larger story, which can last a lifetime. It's a much larger story that can last the history of humanity, because this story has been going on since the beginning, and we can trace the etymology, so to speak, of that story all the way back to the beginning until now, and think about how it has changed over time. So we can say that one thing and extrapolate out into our minds this gigantic vision, so to speak. And I was thinking about how we do the same thing with acronyms in the business place, right? So, because my daughter is starting a new job now, and she's in one of these companies that's very, very technical, and so it's almost all acronyms. The first day of work, they give her a list of like 1,200 acronyms or something.
Oh my God.
She has to know.
A lot.
Yeah, a lot of acronyms. And each of those acronyms is like a mini textbook, so to speak. Because in order to learn what the acronym means, you might learn the words, but you haven't learned anything. Underneath those words is the meaning of how to understand that concept. And underneath that concept is another whole level of technical knowledge that's necessary. And each acronym maybe comes from a different segment of the company, a different aspect of the technology. So by the time you learn all those acronyms, you have learned a lot of compressed data. And then when they begin talking to each other in acronyms, they're carrying this entire compression of data into that one acronym.
Yeah.
And so their discussions are filled with deep information, but it maybe only requires 2 sentences. And why is it that we're capable of that as human beings? I mean, that's just kind of mind-boggling, really. When you think of what a repository our brains are for all this data, and that it's capable of organizing into these very pinpoint, compressed symbols.
Yeah, it is.
And I know you think a lot about symbology. So when you think about symbols in terms of like your co-symbolic project, have you thought about symbols as a data compression?
Not as such, but I think it's my mind is going off in different directions listening to what you're saying, and I'm paying attention. It's not that, but I really don't think I've thought of it that way, but it's really it makes me want to explore that further. I guess the way I look at things at symbol, as far as what I'm trying to get at is what's the most fundamental, or the most elementary building block of meaning, and such that it is universally understood. So like you mentioned, that in the company your daughter's working for, and all these different companies, they have their own acronyms, and they build this lexicon, this library of information, acronyms within them, within the community, and it forms sort of a society or community there of mutual understanding. But outside of that, there's difficulty in communicating. And so this kind of, I mean, not to get off on another topic, but it brings to mind the Tower of Babel and the confusion of the languages. And
I don't think that's another topic at all. I think that's
yeah,
the topic. Okay.
yeah, okay. So there's something about that that story that's illustrative of how things are. You know, it's a story that's being told to illustrate, so that it could be understood about how something came about that we experience today, that they experienced back then when the story was fresh. But who knows how long it was experienced before that, but there's the story that we can point to explain it. And it's sort of a story that lends itself to many different interpretations, I think, and deep meaning.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there's it's interesting that, so what I'm looking at is the essence of, or this idea that there's an implicit symbol, an implicit meaning to something that is sort of like pre-language. And so these symbols would be like a square, for example. If you just look at an image of a square, what does that represent? It represents a square. It's self-representational. We can overlay many meanings on top of that are going to be a confusion, because it all depends on what local groups are assigning to that acronym or that symbol. But the symbol itself has its own sort of prelingual, self-representational essence to it, that I think is related to the way we communicate with art, with music, with these things that are non-verbal, but there's something there that
you associate that with Plato, with Platonic forms, this idea of the prelingual or even pre-thought, that there are certain essences that exist as a concept outside of human thought and human language.
Yeah, maybe. I guess my understanding of the Plato's forms are that there are these sort of perfect, ideal versions of everything that we see on Earth in the heavenly realm, and that there's the ideal form of things exist as an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Idea, perfectly.
Well, is that at all connected to what you were saying about the
think
square?
it
Or
is.
did I pick up
Yeah,
on?
I hadn't really thought about that, but I guess maybe it is. It's I guess the thing that interests me about it is that it's sort of the idea behind science and trying to find the ultimate truth to something. And how do you even communicate that when you start? We were alluding to the fact that there's so much information and so much specialized and complex information that we use these abbreviations and things, but even beyond that, there's so many different rabbit holes, or rabbit trails that people have gone down and explored and detailed out, that one person can't possibly understand the full essence of what another group has uncovered in their lifetime. So but yet underneath all of that, there is maybe an implicit, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that this implicit knowledge and implicit information that is a way of knowing something that you just know.
Do you think that's universal to human beings, or do you think that that's something that comes through education or specialized experience or exposure to art and music? Or do you think all people, regardless of what their background is, have this implicit knowledge?
I do. I think that I guess in the way that I'm thinking of knowledge, even a rock has implicit knowledge. It's not conscious. I'm not talking about panpsychism, but I'm talking about the essence of something, or something having an essence, whether or not it's conscious of itself or it has the instruments of perception that we do or not. Everything still has an essence to it, a soul of sorts.
Idea. I had never really thought about that before, that even a rock has implicit knowledge. I mean, because it must, if concrete reality consists of the particles being arranged in a certain order so that my hand can't go through it, then that thing has an implicit knowledge of some sort that all those particles are in the correct formation for that thing to exist, right?
Yeah,
it has to
right.
be.
Yeah. Something's holding it together.
That never occurred to me. Wow.
I guess on a personal level, I'm interested in it because I just see so much difficulty in communicating, and there's a way, like I watched the debate between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, one, and I forget the moderator's name, but
Eric Weinstein.
Yeah. And so I was watching that debate, and I kept thinking about, and it's been a little while since I've watched it, but as I recall, I was really struck by how they had stated the intention of how they could come together and find the commonality in their worldviews. That was sort of their intention, which was very laudable. But as the debate progressed, there was very little give and take, or very little meeting of the minds. And it seems like Harris's argument had more to do with what I would make the analogy to the Tower of Babel, because it's like he is involved in the modern day construction of the metaphorical tower, because it's this belief that we can, by thought, by thinking that we know how things should be or how things could be better, we can construct or build towards this future golden age, this future golden time where everything is just great. And Peterson was saying, yeah, but wait a minute, we've got all this tradition, and these ancient, these biblical people, the ancient cultures, they knew something, and they had there's these things called archetypes that are transcendent. They go through time, and we're all there's this deep truth. And so in a way, he's pointing towards this past golden age, or some truth that we've lost sight of and we need to keep a hold of, and perhaps return to. And I guess what I'm interested in is, where do those intersect, where we can have that? When can we have the golden age? Now. When can it be now? Well, now is the only time now can be.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I applaud you for watching that debate. I tend to avoid debates like that because I have a very low stress tolerance.
Okay.
And so when there's a lot of antagonism, I check out. And I didn't even have the courage to find out whether or not there was going to be antagonism. I mean, I didn't even try watching a debate. And I know it's two people with strongly opposing views.
Yeah.
I have a hard time with that. But I'm thankful to you for kind of breaking it down thematically for me, because when you talk about Harris's argument, I mean, I can totally see why they were speaking at cross purposes, because I think once Peterson heard Harris make an argument that posits utopia,
mm-hmm.
So politically, I tend a little bit more towards conservatism,
mm-hmm.
because I don't believe that utopias are possible, given
mm-hmm.
the nature of human natural tendency towards corruption.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know myself, not because I'm judging others to be bad or sinful, but I know myself, and I know my own tendency towards bitterness or anger or resentment or all kinds of things that can happen, or greed, or all sorts of human tendencies. If I'm not constantly inputting energy, fighting those things off, they can take over very easily. So when you posit a utopia, and I've heard Harris speak before about this idea that we can make our own morals. I mean, basically, he's coming up with some of the same arguments that Nietzsche made, but I think even Nietzsche recognized that we couldn't devise our own moral system. Well, maybe he didn't recognize it. Maybe that's Peterson's argument, that Nietzsche never really recognized that. So we can't develop our own moral system because we don't have you need something outside the system to set the rules. And that's the whole Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the idea that in any system that has a set of principles, there has to be something a priori. There has to be something outside of that judges that system. And C.S. Lewis goes into this in depth in his book, The Abolition of Man, which is just a beautiful explanation of the kind of unwritten moral laws by which we live, but that those had to be put into us before anything else. So we do have a sort of guidance within us, a sort of subconscious guidance, but even that is not enough to permit for utopia, because the only way utopias can arise is through the use of force, because it's the only way you can control, make sure that
Yeah.
everybody,
Yeah.
that I'm willing to give up what I don't want to give up. The only way you
Yeah.
can give that up is by forcing me one way or another.
Yeah. Yeah. And who has the authority to do that?
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
once coercion comes into the picture,
Mhm.
then you've lost freedom, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So Harris's whole argument is just juvenile. Basically, it falls apart if he's trying to develop a utopia. That's
Yeah.
exactly why the Tower of Babel couldn't work, right?
Right.
It's
Right.
it's too big not to fail, in Peterson's words.
Yes.
They're trying to create this. They're trying to recreate the garden,
Yes.
but
Exactly.
trying to do it through human effort, and it's not going to work because humans are inherently flawed.
Yes.
So then, if Peterson's idea is let's return to the traditions of the golden age, let's make sure that we hold on to all the traditions of the past.
Mm-hmm.
He's also missing, I think one of the things he's missing is
The living. He's missing the living novelty, the living aspect of the emergence of. Well,
well,
go
so
ahead.
I think part of the problem is, and it's not that Peterson is missing those things in his whole complex idea, but for him to explain his whole complex idea to Sam Harris, who has not read his books or listened to 300 hours of his
Yeah.
lectures, right?
Right.
He only has a 2-hour time window.
Yeah.
So he apparently zeroed in on one aspect of his theory.
Yeah.
He had been able to flesh out the whole theory and really discuss his concept of anomaly. And, this whole idea of, you and I have talked about the golden thread, that which leads us forward, this interest level that leads us forward and that helps us navigate the
Yes.
the moral landscape and move upward.
Yeah.
That
Yes.
that
You're
whole,
right.
that whole thing is what
You're right. He
which
didn't have time.
can only operate in freedom. Without
Yes.
freedom, that system of the golden thread cannot operate.
Yes.
And so probably he chose during his 2-hour time to focus on the hierarchy of the past and the tradition and how that wrote these principles of liberty and property into Western civilization and into the
Yeah.
laws that govern us today, that give us the freedom that we have. He chose that narrow avenue to try to talk with Sam Harris. But
Yes.
the other thing is, the scripture says, don't throw your pearls before swine,
Yeah. Yeah.
in the sense that, and I'm not calling Sam Harris swine, I'm just saying that
Yeah.
in this, you can only speak to someone who is at a place where they're willing to hear what you have to say. And
Yeah.
Sam Harris is not really open to hearing anything that requires a transcendent outside source and that requires a recognition of human sin. Those two things he's not willing to consider yet. Because he's not willing to consider those things, you can't really explain to him what the problem is with his viewpoint. Someday he may wake up and be willing to hear those two things, but without those two things, you can't really, it's like giving a pearl to an animal. It doesn't know what to do with it.
Yeah. I think they were both coming at their issues from a defensive place.
Yeah, well, that's always a problem.
Yeah. So they're sort of defending what is at the core of each of their their systems that they in response to what the other one is trying to defend. So, but I think you're exactly right that given enough time, I think that the time that I think the reason why more time would be required and why it's encouraging that they have had more than one debate or conversation and hopefully continue to talk, because it takes time to, like, you have to say what you have to say and then establish certain things that are your core beliefs before you can sort of feel comfortable with you've defended them. And so you can say, okay, I've defended that, now let's move on, and we can see what else we can talk about at the periphery, at the boundaries, where these two worldviews come together. And I don't know that they've got there, but I hope they will get there. And I think that there's things that Harris needs to say about his belief system that would be the corollary of what you just said about Peterson. That there's more to the story, and at the end of and at these outer limits, they're not that different. They're the same, really. And at some point, if they could get to that point, to have more of those peripheral discussions about I think if they could, it has something to do with approaching things as a child, approaching things as if there is a mystery that we don't know the answer to.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the first sort of the spirit of that type. Okay, well, what?
Well, that's one of Jordan's rules.
Yeah. And Harris, to his defense, he says things like that too, and he's like, "Oh, I'm open to this," or I really don't know this. There's something about this meditation or contemplation that I don't quite know why it's beneficial, but I'm going to keep doing it.
So where do you think at the outer limits that there are similarities in their worldviews?
I think the similarity is that they're both trying to, they've both thought a lot about suffering. They've both thought a lot about how to transcend suffering. Is it possible to transcend suffering? Is it possible to, and I think Harris, in essence, they're both trying to, they have good intentions, essentially, that to try to help themselves, to try to help others transcend or work around suffering somehow, to lessen the suffering that people have to do. And I think that, Harris is more like, let's do what we can do with our intellect to actually put an end to this unnecessary suffering. And Peterson is like, well, suffering is a fact of life, and let's try to not lose these schools of thought or philosophies or beliefs that allow us not to sidestep it or improve upon nature, but to make meaning of it, to transform it into meaning for ourselves, so that it is no longer suffering, or it's no longer needless. There is no needless suffering. There is no such thing as needless suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the intersection has to do with suffering.
Yeah, and that does become very complex to talk about, because there are so many people who are suffering, and it would be easy for them in listening to such a conversation to feel that their personal suffering is being diminished or being co-opted, or at a minimum not being understood, because nobody can really understand any individual person's experience of suffering, right? Because suffering is so individual.
Right.
Yeah.
It's hard to talk about, like you said. Yeah.
But the other thing I've noticed, and I noticed this in people whose lives have intersected with mine, who have gone through deep suffering, and in one way or another, I've been able to walk through that suffering with them.
Mm-hmm.
there's always in me a huge temptation to want to fix it for them so that they don't have to go through that, because the side that is kinder to myself would say, because my heart is with them to such an extent and I really am grieved by what I have to see them going through. But there's another reality too, and that is that I am affected by their suffering. It's really scaring me. It's really hurting me. It's making me scared of going through my own suffering, and I need to fix it for them so that I feel better.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
and yet, if I could somehow fix it for them, then there's undoubtedly something that I have, some gift I have prevented them from receiving. And
Yes.
and that's a very, I can only say that with any confidence because I know myself what my own suffering brought me and what I would have missed out on if I hadn't gone through that period of my life. And even the ways that I suffer today about various things. Suffering is a teacher in many ways. So some unnecessary suffering, you can learn a lot about yourself and about the world through that. But even the suffering that I bring on myself teaches me something that I need to know about how to change myself or how to develop or grow. And if somebody else came along and fixed everything for me all the time, I would never learn. I would never grow. I'd still be a toddler.
Yeah, right. And I'm really happy that you're bringing that up, because it's sort of a distinction between empathy and compassion, and why I believe compassion is superior to empathy. It's more useful. And empathy would be just the ability, or the curse, to feel other people's pain, and to in that desire to fix and their pain that has something to do with the pain we feel, because we have that empathic ability. That that is empathy. It's that I hurt because you hurt. But compassion is the way I've thought about it and come to define it for myself, is the way that you've mentioned, that if you know that your life would be meaningless without pain, without some sort of suffering or pain, prolonged pain, emotional, physical, whatever pain it is, and that you know that you've learned these invaluable lessons more than just on a, like practical physical level, like don't touch the stove if it's hot because you'll burn your hand, but more like there's some kinds of pain and suffering that teach us how to live. They just how to endure, how to abide, being alive. And if you can see that someone is suffering, and that has the potential for them to gain meaning, to gain significance, as well as practical knowledge about how to not get hurt in the future, then I think that's more like along the lines of compassion, where you, as you say, you wouldn't want to, it's not that you want to fix or take away their suffering. The desire is that for them to be transformed by their suffering. That's the desire that you have for them. Not for suffering to end, but for it to become meaningful, for it to be a source of, like a gold mine of growth and understanding and richness of meaning for that person.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, to me that's compassion. versus empathy.
Well, so that's really fascinating. I hadn't thought about historically when that change began to take place in our country, but I actually remember now when I started reading articles in news magazines about empathy and how to be more empathetic.
Oh yeah.
And it seems to me it might have come about the same time that more and more people started seeing therapists. I don't know
Huh.
if there's actually a connection to that or not, but I
Mhm.
kind of remember, back in I'm guessing maybe the early 80s or something thereabouts, maybe possibly in the 70s, but maybe the early 80s, I started reading these articles. And before that, we would have always talked about compassion and not about empathy. And then as time went on, we almost always talk about empathy and not compassion.
Huh. Interesting.
And I think that's what we see with the some of the campus movement today is they really push this whole idea of empathy. Get into somebody else's shoes and experience their suffering, and maybe even in some of this movement towards telling people to get out of their privilege and experience someone else's lack of privilege. And I'm not saying that there's not value in that, but that can't be the whole thing, right? The compassion thing has to be, um, maybe it is that empathy is easier to teach. You can teach somebody else empathy in a sort of academic way, but compassion is something that has to be experienced. You have to walk through.
Yeah,
um,
it requires that you sacrifice your victimhood, um, because as long as you consider yourself to be a victim of anything, um, and I'm not saying that that isn't valid, because people are victimized.
yeah.
That's the fact.
Mhm.
But to consider yourself as a victim is different than being victimized. And if you are able to relinquish that, it's actually it's got a hold of you. If you're able to get away from that victim mentality, regardless of whether or not you're a victim in reality, if you don't think of yourself that way, then I think you're able to open yourself up then to this learning. This is what you're able to receive, the gift of what it has to give you. And if you haven't done that yourself, if you haven't received that gift, you're still thinking in terms of, you know, victims and the victim identity type politics and that type of thing, then you can't imagine that someone else's suffering has any sort of value, because you don't know that. You haven't received the value yourself. And I can sit here and say this, a white male that is, doing fine. um, it's easy for me to say that. But if the type of suffering I think you and I are talking about isn't the particular kind of suffering that has to do with being oppressed, it's the kind of suffering that goes along with being a human being that we all have, regardless. Just by virtue of being human, we have suffering. It's just part of the deal.
Mhm.
So it's no one, no matter how privileged you are in the material realm, everyone suffers in greatly in the existential realm, let's say.
Yeah.
you know, or they're trying to avoid that. If
Yeah.
Even if they would deny that they do suffer, it's because they're probably just in denial of it.
Yeah.
So I'm privileged in many ways, but
I like the phrase that you used to sacrifice your victimhood. I hadn't thought of it in that term exactly, but because nowadays victimhood is sort of a privileged status, because the
Mm-hmm.
more victimhood that you can claim on more levels, the higher you can rise in the hierarchy of they have their own privilege system. This whole victimhood system has its own privilege hierarchy.
Yes.
So the more victimhood that you can claim, but at the same time, what would happen to a person who's in that position is that, and I've heard people say this before, that one of the things that led them to Christ was when they were sitting with a dying loved one and they realized they had nothing whatever to offer them. They had no comfort, they had no wisdom, they had no compassion to offer this other person who was suffering so deeply. And it made them realize that there must be a wellspring of that coming from somewhere. There must be some place, some source where you could find wisdom and compassion and understanding, comfort to be able to offer to someone who was suffering so deeply. And that was what led them to search out Christ. And so if you find yourself identifying always as a victim, then you have nothing to give to anyone else who is maybe suffering more than you are. And and that seems to be a huge deficit in that kind of a community. So so I really like this idea that you have of compassion being superior to empathy.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's superior not because of some hierarchy, like I'm better because I have compassion and all you have is empathy.
Yeah.
It's it's superior because it puts suffering in a context that's empowering to the victim. That's empowering to, it allows you to make meaning of your inevitable, unavoidable suffering, no matter what your privilege or underprivilege is, in the world.
I think I would just make one semantic distinction rather than empowering, which is, I know that's a word Jordan Peterson really hates.
Yeah.
Empowering. I maybe ennobling.
Yeah, that's even better.
Yeah.
Like that, yeah.
Ennobling.
Ennobling. Because an ennobling, nobility, king, queen, it honors your sovereignty as a human being of value. Just because you're a human being, it just honors that sovereign nature. So I like that, not your nobility.
I think that's a good place to wrap up. We went a lot longer than I expected, but this last half hour is very, very rich. So this has been great, Alex. I look forward to the next time.
Yeah, likewise, Karen. I enjoyed it.
Okay, talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.